Welcome. In this video we're going to talk about the hosts file and how it can allow us to run a local web server using a domain name which is required for RackForms to run locally. So the basic idea is here I have nytimes.com, and when I type this in and hit enter in my web browser, we're going to go out to the internet and get that website. Massive oversimplification, but what we may not know is that the very first step in this process is to actually consult what's called the hosts file. And the host file is in a two-column format, and what it basically says is anytime this domain is asked for, we're going to go to this IP address. So it's like a miniature version of the internet, almost kind of works. Very simplified, but again, kind of like the same concept. Domain name, route to an IP. In this case, 127.0.0.1 is called our loopback address. So if I copy and paste this into a browser window right here, I'm actually going to go to this page right here. And this is so because this is the default homepage of my web server right now. So domain name, address. Loopback in this case simply means we're not going out to the internet, we're just looping back to our local machine. And I suggest look this up on Wikipedia. It's a really interesting concept if you want to learn a little bit more. But for our case, it just means go to our local machine. We can mess around with this a little bit by adding a host entry for nytimes.com, right? So I could type in 127.0.0.1, and I can chop off all the extra bits except just the raw domain name. I'll save this, and then I'll take the version I was working on and then overwrite my current one. And now, if I restart my browser, copy this address and restart Chrome, we should just go to our local web server address, right? So we're no longer going to the internet to get this page, we're going to a local machine. So again, the reason why that happens is when I type in www.nytimes.com, we're just going to loop back to this local address right here. The key then, of course, is that when we're licensing RackForms, we can now create a domain name, and we're simply going to run locally, right? We don't need a web server anymore. We just run right on a local machine. The host file location, this is covered in the printed docs where this video is embedded in on RackForms.com documentation site. But just as a real quick overview, it's in Windows System 32 drivers, etc. And on Linux and Macs, usually just /etc/hosts. So pretty easy to find. So that's the host component of it. The second part of this equation then is the Apache bit. So you may notice here that I'm actually in my Apache config folder right now. The location of what we're about to do is going to vary depending on what OS that we're using. In this case, I'm using XenServer CE. And so if you want to keep things as simple as possible, I would suggest using XenServer CE as well, because then all the paths will be the same and the general workflow of it will be as well. But yeah, the basic idea then is when I have a host entry, as I do right now, so I type in nytimes, I'm going to go to my local site. Let's say I actually want to see my RackForms login, right? So the newest version. So what I'll actually do is I'm going to open up my vhost file, and I'm going to add a virtual host entry for this. So in this case, it's 3 lines and it's wrapped in this, looks like XML almost. And instead of trying to memorize this, just go ahead and copy and paste this from the documentation site and change the details so they fit you. And those 2 details are this. The first is the path, and then the second is the server name. In this case, the path is basically anywhere we want it to be, but in this case it happens to be C users, Matt's documents, htdocs, and then formboss2. I'm actually going to change this to RackForms. The server name bit then is going to match what we put in our host file. So right now, when I type in NewYorkTimes.com, I'm going to my default website, right? So when we install Apache, it's basically what we do call binds to port 80, so that any request for a website, which is the default when we're in a web browser, is going to look for port 80. And it's basically saying I'm going to serve my default website. I know that this computer has looped back to nytimes.com, but I don't have anything specific for it, so therefore I'm just going to show my default dummy website. The vhost file allows us to get more granular and say, well, actually, if www.nytimes.com is requested, I actually want you to serve the content in this folder right here. right? In this case, it's going to be htdocs RackForms. So what I'll do is I'm going to save this file, and I apologize, you can't see this, but in Zen Server CE, there is a little control panel that we get where we can restart Apache, so I'm just going to do that right now. So I've restarted Apache, and now hopefully, if this works, now when I hit return, I'm actually going to go to the RackForms login, right? So we're saying now that the content in this folder is going to be served whenever nytimes.com is asked for, right? So that's what a virtual host does. It basically says, I'm going to allow you to have several web servers running on the same machine. You just need to tell me what domain name they're running on and where the content is coming from. If I want to undo this change, I'm simply going to go to my host file again, and I'm going to remove this entry, or I could actually just comment it out with a little pound sign like this, save this, overwrite the host file again, and again when I restart my web browser, basically clears that cache out. We're just going to go back to the regular New York Times now. So even though Apache is set up to serve www.nytimes.com, because we don't actually route back to that address anymore, now we've essentially just overridden that behavior. So it's kind of nice in that we can turn that behavior on and off whenever we want to. So that is our quick look at our virtual host. I know it's a bit much to take in the first time, but hopefully this video is giving you a little bit better view of what it looks like. And of course, the big thing is for RackForms, because we need to have a domain name to license to, this gives us the ability to have a domain name which can then allow us to run a web server locally. And finally, as we say in the documentation, this is also really handy because this allows us to have a real web server environment to build websites in. And when it comes to more complicated sites, that is certainly a very, very powerful thing to have, to say this is exactly how the sites can respond when it's live on the internet, right? We have a one-to-one testing environment. So, of course, if you have any questions, info@rackforms.com. Always happy to help, but hopefully this video has helped out.